Congress granted a substantial degree of independence to the Federal Reserve. That independence is, of course, independence from the executive branch. It is not and cannot be independence from the Congress itself.
One of the points that I've been trying to make, and that is transparency of the Federal Reserve. It sounded to me like the majority here is for independence, which is a code word for secrecy, and in opposition to transparency.
Welcome to Best Evidence. I'm John Titus. This is the third episode in the War for Bankocracy series, which, as a reminder, is available at Solari.com, Catherine Austin Fitz's website, together with all the constituent parts of the series, the video clips, the statutes, and the research it relies on. The link is in the description box below. If you're interested, in the first two episodes, we saw how the U.S. Constitution is standing between the privately owned Federal Reserve banks and something that they very much want, which is total secrecy from public inspection and the unlimited capacity to do with the country's money coining prerogative whatever they please. We saw how those goals are legally out of reach, they are constitutionally out of reach, and that the Fed's addiction to secrecy was actually thwarted as a matter of historical fact during the global financial crisis. In this episode, we are going to look at the Fed's workaround to these problems. The Fed desperately wants to be legally and factually independent from the country, just like the ECB is independent from European countries. And for this reason, the Fed has a long-time propaganda campaign aimed at persuading Congress and persuading the public into waiving their rights to transparency and into voluntarily handing over to the Fed the very thing that the Constitution forbids. That propaganda campaign is called Federal Reserve Independence, and its basic pitch, I have to tell you, is really, it's just downright childish. As the pitch has it, the economy will do wonderful and magical things if only Congress would just leave the Fed alone and let the high priests of finance engage in freestyle monetary operations, meaning buy assets from their crony buddies. It is one of the biggest propaganda campaigns ever. It is a base appeal to greed and ego, and it's been going on for 3 decades. Not only has the pitch never been true, the Federal Reserve independence pitch was reduced to absolute ash during the pandemic, as you are about to see in this episode. But no one noticed that Federal Reserve independence theory was reduced to ash because financial and economics professionals were too busy patting themselves on the back while they slobbered all over their ballooning stock portfolios. No one noticed, that is, except for this channel, as the Fed's crony large-scale asset purchases were going on in real time back in 2020.
And the Fed says, nullity, some of our research has suggested that an investment in Tesla, for example, the Tesla stock, that might be a prudent investment at this juncture. And then Nullity might respond by saying, well, that's a coincidence because we here at Nullity were talking just the other day about how we would really like to buy $500 million of Tesla stock and dump that U.S. Treasury, which we otherwise wouldn't get a good price for, and we're willing to part with $500 million to do that.
So while the Fed was busy pumping up the stock market and seeding the current bout of inflation that we've been suffering from for 2 to 3 years, economists were pretending that all those asset purchases were being done to fight a virus. It is thus utterly predictable that the Biden White House memo is written as if there's been no inflation for the last 30 years. The highlighting you see is from the last couple episodes when we talked about the White House's claim, the Biden White House's claim, that central banks govern entire economies and entire nations, and we saw that's totally false in the U.S. But let's zoom in on the previous paragraph, the second paragraph, and focus on it because the aim of the entire paper is found right there. Let's zoom in and get right to the money shot. Here you go. Central bank independence requires that the Federal Reserve's operational activities to achieve its dual mandate occur without political pressure or interference. So you see the grand prize right there. The Fed must be allowed to conduct operational activities without congressional oversight in order to achieve the dual mandate, which the paper tells us the dual mandate is maximum employment and price stability. So in other words, the theory is you must leave the Fed alone during its operational activities because that's the best way to get price stability. And they later on tell us that means lower inflation. We will get to that. For now, we want to know what operational activities means. And for that, let's bring in the New York Fed website. And you can see right there, permanent open market operations. That's what operational activities means. It means purchases or sales of securities to implement monetary policy. So that means purchasing and selling assets. It really means buying assets. The Fed doesn't really sell assets. They roll off the balance sheet, but they sure as heck buy assets. Now that we know that, let's go back to the White House memo and reread what we saw before. Central bank independence requires that the Feds be allowed to buy assets without congressional oversight, without any checks and balances. That's what they're after here. And supposedly they're doing this to achieve the dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment, supposedly doing it to control inflation. We're going to see just how false that is, how laughable that is in this episode. But that's the grand prize. Let the Fed buy assets without oversight. And by the way, there's a ton of research, theory, and evidence to support that that's the best way to get lower inflation. Famous last words. We'll get to that research and evidence in due course, but there you have it, the basic pitch. There's a ton of research and studies showing that central banks that buy assets without oversight by their legislature, meaning by Congress or by Parliament, get higher employment and lower inflation for their countries. Now, before I run some Federal Reserve independence ads for your viewing pleasure that make this pitch, I want you to notice the internal inconsistency at work here with the pitch, at least in the U.S. The promoters of Federal Reserve independence are arguing that central banks that are independent get better economic results. But if the Fed were truly independent, why would anybody make that argument in the first place? They wouldn't. If the Fed were legally independent, like the ECB and like other central banks around the world, and they aren't held on a leash called the U.S. Constitution, there simply wouldn't be any reason to argue for independence. Do you hear anyone arguing for the right of 18-year-olds to vote? No, you do not. They've had that right for over 50 years due to the 26th Amendment of the Constitution. No one's arguing for that anymore. The reason the Fed, the entire Federal Reserve independence argument, in other words, is a dead giveaway that the Federal Reserve is not independent, which is why they're arguing for it to begin with. But they can't really tee up their pitch honestly. The Fed can't tee that pitch up honestly without owning up to the fact that its real argument is that the U.S. Constitution is wrong and needs to be changed, because the Fed is not ready to do that yet. But that's the goal, remember that. The point for now is that when you hear a Federal Reserve independence pitch, keep the end goal in mind. You're hearing an argument for why you should treat the Fed as independent of the government, even though it most certainly is not. It's independent only of the president. We saw that in episode 1, and that's a fundamentally narrower proposition. Okay, with that out of the way, what we want to do now is hear some Federal Reserve independent pitches from some of the Fed's leading spokesmodels, and then we'll see if the pitches are supported by the evidence or not. But in any case, let's hear from the Fed's slugger during the global financial crisis, and that is none other than Ben Bernanke. There he is. Take it away, Ben.
History shows that one of the best things you can do to create a strong, stable economy is to have a strong central bank, which is independent of political pressures. Central banks that are not independent, that are subject to short-term political pressures, are going to make short-term decisions that aren't the best for the economy.
Okay. Notice he's shilling for the very thing that the law will not give him, which is the legal status that the European Central Bank has, independence from political pressure, meaning no checks and balances from Congress. So his argument, Bernanke's argument, isn't legal, it's practical. independence is what's best for the economy, supposedly. But because we know that the law doesn't remotely support that result, that outcome, the question is, what does? And Bernanke tells us in the very next clip. Here we go.
There's an enormous amount of evidence that shows that countries with strong central banks that are free from short-term political pressures get better results.
Okay, so his argument for Fed independence is based on, quote, an enormous amount of evidence, end quote, showing that independent central banks get better results. Pretty vague. So like any marketing slogan, it's good gum, it tastes great, it's less filling. The Federal Reserve independence ad is deliberately vague. And Bernanke is altogether silent on what the evidence is that he's talking about. So the ad is vague and lacks support, which brings us to our next Federal Reserve independence ad. Here is Federal Reserve spokesmodel number 2. That is Janet Yellen. She was the Fed chairperson, right after Ben Bernanke. Take it away, Janet Yellen.
Central banks around the world in recent decades have gained this independence, and the economic outcomes that have resulted from this trend towards central bank independence, we have seen much better macroeconomic
So there's actually
performance.
studies showing that banks that have that sense of independence, that there have been improvements in those countries?
Yes, there is clear evidence of better outcomes in countries where central banks can take the long view, are not subject to short-term political pressures, and sometimes central banks need to do things that are not immediately popular for the health of the economy.
That was absolutely masterful. Janet Yellen is obviously working from the same script as Ben Bernanke. In other words, no political input to the Federal Reserve from Congress gives you better results. And again, there's no evidence. She cites no evidence to support that. But notice that Janet Yellen drops a nugget that Bernanke did not, namely that central banks sometimes do things that are not popular. What she's referring to there is the Fed bailing out Wall Street by massively expanding its balance sheet during the global financial crisis, which Janet Yellen is most certainly correct, was extremely unpopular. Congress was all over the Fed about that. And that's a key thing to remember. The global financial crisis represents an extremely useful data point for testing the central bank independence hypothesis, because the Fed bought assets and expanded its balance sheet. It conducted operational activities, to borrow the White House memo language. And it did those things under intense political pressure not to bail out Wall Street banks, not to save their bacon by printing money and buying their assets. According to the central bank independence hypothesis, the Federal Reserve independence hypothesis, that should have led to bad economic results compared to an environment with no political pressure at all. We'll get to that second scenario, that second data point, in a minute. For now, let's get back to the White House memo, because unlike Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, the Biden White House memo actually does point to specific evidence for its claims. Okay, here we are back at the memo. Let's see, we're going to see if there's any evidence to support the White House claim that central bank independence gives better results. And it's right in the middle paragraph, right below the highlighting with research. Here you go, watch the research. Research, theory, and evidence all reveal that a central bank's ability to carry out monetary policy without political interference is a critical component of its ability to control inflation. So that's the specific pitch. Research and evidence show that no oversight of the Fed, meaning without political interference, that's what that means, gives you better results. But here, unlike Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, the White House is not so vague. The result thereafter here is controlling inflation. And this better result, this control of inflation, is cited by the White House as the reason that advanced economies like the U.S. are supposedly governed by independent central banks. Okay? The point of this exercise, though, is that at the end, you see this footnote 1, which is supposedly citing authority to support the notion that better economic results, specifically the control of inflation, is the product of independent central banks. Now, we already know that this footnote number 1 isn't citing any legal authority, because there isn't any legal authority for the proposition that the Federal Reserve is independent of the government. Instead, the footnote is citing evidence that central banks that conduct operational activities free from political input, free from participation or oversight by Parliament or by Congress, that produces better economic results with respect to inflation. The question is, does the evidence really show better economic results and lower inflation? Let me tell you something right here. That footnote cites a long series of papers, and in every single pitch for central bank independence that I've seen, what you see authors is doing exactly what we'll see the White House do, which is dropping a long string cite to a bunch of academic papers. Long string cites are intended to convey the impression of consensus among experts, number 1, as well as the impression that it's not even worth your effort to actually read the authority cited, because it's simply a lost cause. There's just overwhelming evidence in favor of the proposition. I personally am familiar with long string cites from decades of patent litigation in federal courts, and whenever I see one, I know right away that the proposition being advanced is likely false, number 1, and that number 2, I probably won't have to venture beyond the four corners of the cited authority itself to prove it's wrong, which is pretty awesome, because the opposing counsel has done the research for me. I just read the cases they cite, and invariably they undermine the proposition. Long string cites are typically a bullying tactic used by junior varsity liars who simply don't know how to make a case, how to build a case based on actual facts. Okay, with that pro tip in mind, let's see what the long string cite in the Biden White House memo is all about. Okay, here in the middle of the page is footnote 1 from the White House memo. It's on page 4 of the memo. And as you can see, the first reference is a paper by Alesina and Summers from 1993. Let's just take a look at that paper by flipping to it really quickly. Here it is: Central Bank Independence and Macroeconomic Performance, Some Comparative Evidence. So this is the peak of Bernanke's enormous pile of evidence. And yes, Larry Summers is Larry, the former Treasury Secretary. Let's go ahead and scroll up, and let's see what Larry has to say about the better economic results we can expect from having an independent central banks. Here we go. Our conclusion is that while central bank independence promotes price stability, it has no measurable impact on real economic performance. How very curious. So the number 1 central bank independence reference says it has no impact on real economic performance, raising the question of why Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen would expressly tell us that independent central banks give us, to quote Janet Yellen, quote, much better macroeconomic performance, end quote, when the actual evidence you're looking at right here from their own team's leadoff hitter, Larry Summers, says that that's false, except with respect to price stability, with respect to inflation. Okay. Well, one answer to that question might be, at least you get lower inflation if there are no checks and balances on the Fed. The problem is that Larry said that way back in 1993, which is 15 years before the Fed printed trillions of dollars to bail out Wall Street banks during the global financial crisis. Remember, that's test point number 1 for the central bank independence hypothesis. In 1993, when Larry wrote that paper, is over 25 years before the second test point, which is when the Fed printed another $4 to $5 trillion during the pandemic. So Larry's paper, at least insofar as the issue of inflation is concerned, isn't just passé, it's useless, because it cannot and does not speak to either one of the 2 biggest operational activities in Federal Reserve history. I mean, if you're the Biden White House and you're telling people the Fed needs to be left to its own devices so that it's free to buy assets in any volume at once from whomever it wants, because that's the best way to control inflation, you absolutely are obligated to address both multi-trillion-dollar asset buying binges in the Fed's history, the first one in 2008 and the second one in 2020. I mean, there's only 2 asset buying binges in Federal Reserve history. It's really not that tall an order to address both of them. Larry's paper predates both of those binges by 15 years or more and isn't going to cut it, although I do appreciate his casual annihilation of Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen's claim of better macroeconomic performance. What's remarkable is that the other papers in footnote 1 also fail to cover both Fed asset buying binges, with one exception. So what we want to do is we want to go back to footnote 1 to the string site, and we want to find the one paper that's actually on point, that's actually relevant, in other words, to the White House's very own inflation thesis. Okay, here you see the string site again in footnote number 1. We're looking for the reference that covers both the global financial crisis and the pandemic. So let's just go through them. There's 5 references. Okay, we've done the first one. The second one is from 1992 by Kucherman. That's irrelevant because it's too early, like Larry's paper. Garriga is the right date, but the data here only goes through 2014. You can look the paper up and see that that's true. Unsel's got the same basic problem. It's written in 22, but its data only goes through 2018. Okay, so that's irrelevant really to our purposes here. This last reference, though, this is a different story. This reference here, Adrian Kahn and Menand from 2024, and yes, it is Menand and not Nemard. For whatever reason, the White House butchered this guy's name. Not sure why. That paper covers both episodes. In other words, it covers both the global financial crisis and the pandemic when the Fed expanded its balance sheet in both of those events. So we definitely want to take a look at this paper. Here you go, a new measure of central bank independence. And you can see the names here, Adrian, Kahn, and like I told you, it's Menand. Not sure what's up with the White House there. This title, New Measure of Central Bank Independence, we're going to come back to it, but let's just cut right to the chase here and get into the paper. Let's just zoom in. And you can see right away, central banks are among the most important economic governance institutions. Interesting word choice there. They manage the money supply in ways that impact inflation. Okay, that's where we are. So we're getting warmer. But like I said, this paper is valuable because it covers both episodes. Here you go. The global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Okay, so what does this tale of two crisis periods tell us? Here you go. Here it is. Both of these episodes led to significantly expanded central bank balance sheets, but it was the latter episode which prompted rapid price increases in the price levels in many countries. So it was expanded central bank balance sheets that gave us increases in the price levels in many countries. Central banks bought assets on a massive scale, and this is what caused inflation, but only during the latter episode, not during the global financial crisis. And that's a very interesting thing. But let's back up a second. All these central banks around the world, despite being independent, and despite 30 years of propaganda from every crevice of finance and economics, telling us that independent central banks with no political input and no pressure and no checks and balances at all, that these independent central banks are the best way to control inflation, suddenly inflation explodes. And now we're told, whoopsie, independent central banks can give us massive inflation, rapid price increases, at least under some set of unknown circumstances. Now, you might think the paper would try to figure out what those circumstances are. If so, you have misunderstood the job of finance and economics professors within a debt-based monetary system. The role of academics in finance and economics isn't to learn the truth, it's to conceal the truth by producing pseudo-scientific narratives that advance the interests of a minuscule group of people allowed to issue debt-based money and charge the rest of its interest on it, all while they hide behind the corporate facade of central banks. Let's go back to the paper and see what it says about each episode, each one of the Fed's two large-scale asset purchasing binges. Okay, here we are back at the paper. One balance sheet expansion, as we saw, causes inflation. The other one doesn't. But rather than try to discover why that is, the paper is premised on its preordained conclusion that independent central banks are the best thing since sliced bread. And the paper actually works its way backwards to find, get this, a new measure of central bank independence. So if your yardstick tells you that independent central banks are causing inflation to go through the roof, well, you just change your yardstick around and come up with a new measure of central bank independence to give your bosses the result that you know they want, even without being told. Yeah, I would say unbelievable, but it's actually what I've come to expect from an entire profession set up to service the tiny handful of people who get royalties on the entire money supply merely for putting ink onto paper. And by the way, don't think for a second that the authors of that paper somehow broke ground by saying that expanded balance sheets caused inflation during the pandemic, because they didn't. They weren't the first. That paper was from February of 2024, as you just saw. Other people were much, much faster to admit and talk about what actually went on during the pandemic. And one of them was a very prominent former banker, very prominent former central banker in May of 2022, 2 years before that paper. That person is Mervyn King, shown here on the right. He was the governor of the Bank of England from 2003, 2013. King is going to discuss what caused inflation by discussing the crucial factor, which is the money supply held by businesses and households. That's his terminology. It's the English banker's way of saying bank deposits. It was expanded bank deposits that gave us inflation. But listen as Mervyn King identifies the culprit behind our inflationary woes. Here we go.
In March 2020, people argued, well, there's some disruption in financial markets. We better intervene and print money to prevent a collapse of certain financial markets. But that went away within a matter of weeks. And at that point, you would have expected central banks to withdraw the support that they were giving. Rather than withdrawing it, they doubled down and did a lot more. And I think if you just print a great deal of money, it was most extreme in the United States, where the Federal Reserve printed money at a rate that was faster than at any point since the Second World War.
After COVID?
After COVID started, 2020, 2021. Their money supply held by businesses and households was growing at 25% a year. Now, you don't have to believe in a mechanical link between that and inflation, but you should be asking yourself the question, what do we think is going on here? If we keep printing money at this rate, what will happen? And the answer is obvious. You'll get inflation.
Okay. That interview was May 20th. That interview was published May 20th, 2022. And just 1 month later, after that interview, after one of the most prominent central bankers in the world threw the United States Federal Reserve under the bus, the Fed chairman himself, Jay Powell, finally admits in Senate testimony that, the way to bring down inflation is to reduce the Fed's balance sheet, which had gone, at the time of the testimony you're going to see, had gone from $4.2 trillion in March of 2020 to $8.9 trillion in May of 2022. And it gave us inflation, just like Mervyn King said. And now we need to reverse that process and bring inflation back down. Listen as Jay Powell himself directly ties inflation to the Fed's balance sheet. Here, Powell is answering questions from Louisiana Senator John Kennedy. Kennedy is going to complain about the Fed's balance sheet going from $1.5 trillion to $9 trillion. But $1.5 trillion, that was back during the global financial crisis. That's not really the right starting point for a meaningful analysis. I'll talk about that in a bit. I'll get to that in a bit. What we're interested in here with Powell is his admission that the Fed's balance sheet and inflation are directly linked. They're arm in arm. And in order to reduce inflation, the Fed now needs to reduce its balance sheet. Listen to this.
Mr. Chairman, the United States Congress, in addition to its regular budget, has spent $7 trillion. I'm not saying all of it was unnecessary. On top of that, the Fed's increased its balance sheet from $1.5 trillion to $9 trillion. $9 trillion. I know you're cutting it back, but we've injected all of this money into the economy, and then people go, well, we have inflation. Duh. Give me some help here. Tell me what we can do.
I'm really focused on what we can do, which is shrink our balance sheet and raise interest rates and get supply and demand back into alignment and get inflation back down to 2%.
Okay, there you go. Jay Powell just told you that to reduce inflation, the Fed needs to cut its balance sheet down from $9 trillion. So now we want to see how the Fed balance sheet caused inflation in the first place. And to do that, we're going to use the Fed's own FRED database, Federal Reserve Economic Database, because it has chart functionality. And in particular, we want to compare the Fed's balance sheet with total bank deposits in the U.S. Those two things, the Fed's balance sheet on the one hand and bank deposits on the other hand, for the entire history of the Fed, those were two different animals up until the pandemic. But that changed decisively and intentionally in 2020, as you are about to see. So let's go take a look at a pair of charts here. Here we are looking at the Fed's balance sheet, the liability side of its balance sheet. The liability side is the money side, back to 2003. Let's focus first on the pandemic. And I've got the tooltip here, which gives us interesting data as we drag it along. It gives us the date and the amount. So let's go to the beginning of right when the Fed started to add to its balance sheet. Its asset purchase binge started basically March 4th, 2020. The balance sheet then was $4.203 trillion, as you can see. Let's then go as close as we can to 2 years later, to March. That's as close as we're going to get. And the balance sheet is now $8.863 trillion. That's a gain of $4.66 trillion in exactly 2 years. But the pandemic, this huge increase in the Fed's balance sheet during the pandemic, that gray bar is right when the pandemic started. That was not the Fed's first rodeo when it came to massive asset purchases. The first time was during the global financial crisis. And that's this big gray bar here that went on for quite a while. But let's try to go pick out some data points here. Let's go to when the Fed started buying assets. There you go. September 3rd, 2008. Balance sheet is $864 billion, so $0.864 trillion. Then the Fed prints tons of money to bail out Wall Street banks, some European banks too. And this is what Yellen was referring to. And she's right. This was not popular when the Fed did this. But the point here is that let's go 2 years later. Let's go to September. How close can we get it? September 1. There we are. And now you see the balance sheet is $2.245 trillion. So that's a gain of $1.38 trillion in 2 years. But there was no inflation then. There was deflation then. So when Kennedy said the balance sheet went from $1.5 trillion to $9 trillion, he's mixing deflation from the global financial crisis with inflation caused by the asset purchases in the pandemic. Those are two different episodes. Those are two different purposes, the asset purchases. This here, the asset purchases by the Fed, this is about bailing out banks. The Fed printed money and used it to buy assets from banks. And the reason for that was to prevent banks from failing and preventing customer deposits from being wiped out. The pandemic was totally different, different animal. The Fed printed money here too, a lot more money, and used it to buy assets from non-banks. The reason cited was to combat a virus, whatever. The point is that buying assets from non-banks is night and day different from buying assets from banks. And to prove that to you, I'm going to add a second line in red to this graph showing bank deposits. Now, bank deposits are much bigger than the Federal Reserve balance sheet. So this blue line is going to compress down toward the x-axis. But what you're going to see, you're going to know it's the same graph because you're going to see this lopsided shark mouth here. You see the tooth here and the tooth here and the shark here. I'm going to add this second line to bank deposits. And this blue line is going to get squashed down. Here you go. Bank deposits in red. Let me change my cursor color here quick. There we go. Yeah, green marker. But here's what you see. let's look at this. Let's focus again on the pandemic and just go to the same set of dates. Let's start at March 4th. Okay. And you can see there, bank deposits are $13.436 trillion. $13.438 trillion. And then exactly 2 years later, March 2nd, there you go. Bank deposits are $18.074 trillion. That's a gain of $4.64 trillion. We already saw that the Fed's balance sheet went up by $4.66 trillion. That's a virtual match. So in other words, every dollar that the Fed spent buying assets from non-banks here, it showed up in bank deposits here, dollar for dollar. $4.66 trillion here, $4.64 trillion here. That's why Mervyn King said, and Jerome Powell admitted that a Fed increase in the balance sheet caused inflation during the pandemic. That simply didn't go on during the pandemic at all. You can see here that there's a temporary blip when the Fed begins its binge here, but it reverts back to the mean almost immediately. But no effect at all. Bank deposits just kept on trucking back then. This is back when the Fed was buying assets from banks. I did video after video after video about that. Not going to rehash that here. There are two big takeaways from all that. Number one, we know the names of the banks that got trillions of dollars from the Fed in the global financial crisis. We'll see that big time in the next episode. But we know the banks' names. We still don't know, though, who got any. We don't know who got the first penny of the $4.5 trillion that the Fed printed during the pandemic. Why is that? Why don't we know? We don't know because Congress didn't press the Fed. Congress gave the Fed, in other words, exactly what Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen and the financial experts asked for. No oversight, total independence, no checks and balances, as the Fed bought asset after asset after asset from whomever it wanted and in whatever amounts it wanted, which the Fed decided without any input would be 100% non-banks. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that as a result of that, the Federal Reserve, having been left alone to run whatever monetary operations, whatever operational activities that it wanted, caused inflation all by itself. There is no one else to blame for that but the Fed. During the global financial crisis, Congress was all over the Fed about who it was bailing out and in what amounts. That's what the next episode is all about. During the pandemic, Congress never said peep about the Fed's balance sheet until after the damage was done and inflation was baked into the cake. Then Congress suddenly gets angry. But even then, Congress never asked the Fed about what happened, never asked the Fed who got the $4.5 trillion, and never asked why the balance sheet increase in the global financial crisis didn't cause inflation, but it did cause inflation during the pandemic. And the Fed, for its part, once it finally admitted there even was inflation, for a while, remember, there was no inflation. Then it was like, well, it's transitory. Guess what? It's not transitory. Okay, when it finally admits there's no hiding the inflation, it blames everything under the sun except its own $4.5 trillion asset buying binge. Take a look at what Powell told Congress on June 16, 2020. The balance sheet at that time had gone from $4.2 trillion to $7.1 trillion in 3 months, a 70% increase in 3 months. Now, Jay Powell knows damn well where that money went. It's not like the Fed just dropped $3 million down a crowded street. The Federal Reserve specifically and intentionally bought those $3 trillion of assets from non-banks. It knows who they are. Listen to what Jay Powell says. It knows every single one of those $3 trillion is going to show up in their buddies' bank accounts. Now, remember, this is June 2020, so it's peak freakout season, and everything is on Zoom, so the video quality isn't as high, but here we go.
I'd like to now shift to the balance sheet of the Fed. You've been on the Fed a number of years, and you've been an investor in past life and so forth. Does it bother you as the Fed chairman to see that the balance sheet has grown so fast? And I know these are extraordinary times, and you've got to have extraordinary measures. But to deleverage the balance sheet as it's growing and probably continue to grow is going to be a thing for the future, but it's going to be a real challenge for somebody, is it not?
Well, so first, I don't think that the balance sheet at anything like its current size presents any real threat to either inflation or to financial stability.
Okay, if you didn't notice, that was Senator Shelby asking Powell if blowing up the Fed's balance sheet by $3 trillion is going to cause inflation. And Powell says no. We're going to come back to that. But notice what Senator Shelby doesn't ask Powell in that clip. He never asked Powell who got the $3 trillion when the Fed printed that amount of money and bought assets from non-banks. Back in 2009, in the global financial crisis, when the Fed printed less than $2 trillion and bought assets, Shelby and Congress rightfully wanted to know who got that money, and they complained about no transparency. But that was back then, over 15 years ago. That was during the global financial crisis. Now fast forward to the pandemic, and instead of outrage from Congress, we get fear. You heard Shelby say, we need extraordinary measures for extraordinary times due to the, oh my God, pandemic. So because of his fear, Shelby's not asking the right questions. He's not demanding transparency. He withdraws the political pressure he put on the Fed 10 plus years earlier during the global financial crisis. And the withdrawal of pressure is exactly what Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen and the experts said would help the economy and said would reduce inflation. So Shelby defers totally to the Fed's judgment during the pandemic and listens passively as Powell tells him, erroneously as it turns out, that a $3 trillion expansion of the Fed's balance sheet won't cause inflation. Don't worry about it. And Shelby and Congress never pushed back on the Fed. They never questioned how buying $3 trillion, eventually $4.5 trillion of assets, helps fight a virus. Ridiculous. Instead, it's, oh my God, I got the sniffles on a Tuesday morning. Would you please print $3 trillion and use it to buy assets from your buddies? Ridiculous. And what happens? What happens? Inflation explodes in everyone's face. And look, I'm not picking on Senator Shelby. That guy was an absolute warrior during the global financial crisis. He was one of the only ones in Congress asking any questions at all of the Fed. And he was a big ringleader for transparency, along with Bernie Sanders and along with Ron Paul. But that was over 15 years ago. 5 years ago, during the pandemic, Shelby and everyone else in Congress fell down on the job due to their fear. Remember that. We're going to come back to that in a later episode. Also remember that in the current climate of fear as well. For now, the point is this. The sales pitch for Federal Reserve independence always pushes the benefits of leaving the Fed alone, and that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. Fear reduced Congress to abject servitude of private power and scared Congress away from fulfilling its constitutional duty to oversee the Fed and rein it in. Congress let the Fed buy assets from whoever it wanted to in whatever amounts it wanted to, and never asked any questions of the Fed, and the result was disaster that we're living with to this day. The Fed blew up its balance sheet while no one said a word, cowering behind their masks, and look what happened. We got huge inflation that's still with us. It's not going away. And here's the punchline. We still don't know who got $4.5 trillion that the Fed printed during the pandemic. We are most assuredly coming back to that issue in due course. In the next episode, though, I'm going to show you what the Fed looks like, what the Federal Reserve looks like when the Constitution is allowed to work. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you for episode 4 in a couple weeks. You don't want to miss that one. Now, if you want to contribute to the channel and to the series, information is below. So everyone who's contributed so far, thank you so much for your support. The channel is on its way to extending production possibilities. Get to that in due course too. But it's gratifying to know that I am connecting in a real way with like-minded souls. Take care for the next 2 weeks, and I will see you soon for episode 4.